Welcome to the Affiliated Monitors Expert Podcast, hosted by Tom Fox on the Compliance Podcast Network. Today I have back with me Vin DeCiani from Affiliated Monitors, and we're going to conclude this five-part exploration by taking a look at some of Affiliated Monitors' reviews of an ethical culture as a part of an organizational ethical and compliance assessment. So with that somewhat tongue-tied and twisted introduction, Vin, thank you and welcome back to the podcast.
Thanks, Tom.
So Vin, let's just hop right into it, and let me ask you, what areas or indicators does Affiliated Monitors assess around an ethical culture?
So, it's a very interesting sort of profession to be in, right? To being an outsider going into an established organization to look at their culture, right? And so you have to have sort of a framework for what you're looking at. And oftentimes that involves, starting with the program itself. What does the compliance program look like? And does it meet the sort of the foundational tenets of a good program? Is it educational? Does it have a process for detection? And is there some type of remediation when something is found? So you're looking at that, structure, but then diving in to see not only what the program looks like, but then looking at what they're doing for training to educate their staff. Are they really touching on the elements of the parts of education that the staff, it's meaningful to them in their positions. So you're looking at that by talking to the people, in the field. You received ethics training, and you are a linesman, on a project. And so you're getting ethics training on antitrust, and that kind of stuff. And so it's not necessarily meaningful to those people as to what and how compliance applies to them. But we're looking at that in depth. The detection pieces, hotlines and communications, are people comfortable using a hotline? That's an important element of an assessment. All of those kinds of things. And then the last one, and I think this one is the one that's the most important, when we talk about culture and, the effectiveness of compliance program and that kind of thing, and that is accountability and enforcement. So some companies have very strict, disciplinary processes for dealing with ethics violations. And then you find out, and this is again, sometimes through the third party's efforts, they're meaningless. That there is no, effective disciplinary process, or it's not fair, it's not objective, it's not balanced. It's a program that doesn't necessarily fulfill its obligations. So when you're looking at culture, you're looking at those sort of foundational elements, and then, as we've talked about, you're looking at all of the other sort of holistic pieces around an ethical culture. The recruiting process, the performance metrics, the communications process, internal controls, and those kinds of things. We do that. That's what an assessment by an independent is looking at. So I hope that helps.
Eric, Vin, you have now said in a couple of different podcasts something very similar, which I've written down as, is there institutional fairness? You have commented several times about the importance of people being treated fairly. You've talked about fairness in, obviously, discipline, but also in promotions, in compensation, in those that may be in an inside group as opposed to an outside group. Who gets to even talk to senior management? That seems to be a theme that you feel is extremely important.
I do. And I again, if you're talking about culture, you're talking about people, right? And people and how they perceive things and how they perceive their role and how they perceive people above them. And again, above them being the senior leaders, and are the senior leaders being fair? Or is there a perception of, if you're on the inside, you do well, and if you're not on the inside, then you don't do well? I think that's sort of a foundational element of a strong culture, and that is, how do you treat your people, and how do they see themselves within this organizational structure? So, it's a theme that, when you're talking to people in focus groups and in interviews, that's one of the things that is very important to them. this perception of fairness and objectivity and transparency. So this really comes from the vantage point of those people who work, on the line, in the geographies, outside of headquarters, and even at headquarters, if you're not necessarily in a management position. But Tom, I think it's an elemental consideration that everyone has to have, in looking at an ethical culture.
Vin, over the past 2 or 3 months, we've heard talks from the number two, the Deputy Attorney General at the Department of Justice, and the head of the SEC about the importance of corporate culture. But I wanted to use that as an introduction to ask you, do you see equally important the ability or the need, rather, for corporations to assess their culture so that they can, try to remediate it or fix it if needed?
Yeah, I think it's absolutely. Too many times companies put in, these gold-plated ethics and compliance programs, and then they roll them into the DOJ or to the SEC and say, "Oh, look, we have this great program," and then you find out that it's just a paper program. Looking at how to make that program real and how to make it impactful. I call it, how do you get staff invested in that program? And you do it, through all of the kinds of things that we've been talking about, education, detection, those kinds of things, and remediation. That type of assessment, as we've talked about previously, sometimes is very difficult for a company to do itself. That sometimes there's a sort of a false facade that they find, within this culture. And it's not necessarily, a lot of depth, or they go into a survey or whatever they're trying to do to assess with, sort of an expectation of what their finding is going to be before they actually do the survey. As an independent, you're getting an unvarnished and an objective review of what the company's program and culture looks like, and that's huge. But then an important element of that is bringing that up to senior leadership. Because sometimes it's an eye opener for senior leadership to hear from an independent what's really going on, within the organization. So I think I've answered your question.
Yeah. So let me just use that really as a basis to ask, what kinds of recommendations does Affiliated Monitors bring to the table to help a company strengthen, fix, remediate, or even improve a ethical culture?
Right. So, you've heard me talk about this, but a lot of times they're people issues, and they're not, these neon signs or these flashy policies and processes that companies will put in place, employee of the month, or, something that is very flashy, but only lasts for 10 minutes. If you're going to make cultural change, you have to do it in a way that is effective, that really touches people, and it's not just the flavor of the month kind of thing. So a lot of times the recommendations we make are not necessarily you need to create a new policy or you need to buy, a new piece of equipment. They're much more, learn about your people, learn about what's important to them. Get them involved in the compliance and ethics culture. Have them speak up, at a meeting by them, leading a discussion on an ethical moment. Have them participate in the creation of a policy or the training that's going on. You're spreading the word, and you're bringing more people involved. Getting more people involved in that culture. It can't be just a push down, to people. It has to be a part of their everyday existence. That's, one of the recommendations that we would make typically. I mean, there's many more, but that's one. I think the other one that I can't, emphasize this enough is accountability. If there are violations, if there are serious violations of an ethics policy of the company, be it conflicts of interest or code of conduct, and nothing is done about it, everybody knows about that, right? And so it diminishes all of the efforts that have gone into creating this, this program and, trying to have an ethical culture, and then you don't do anything to enforce it when something serious happens. It's a futile exercise.
Well, Vin, unfortunately, we're near the end of our time, but I've been visiting today with Vin DiCiani, and we've been taking a look at affiliated monitor reviews of an ethical culture as part of an organizational and ethical and cultural assessment. This concludes our 5-part series, but frankly, I cannot wait to explore some of these topics in much greater detail. So I look forward to continuing the conversation, Vin.
Thank you, Tom. I agree. It's a very fertile area.
Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox again. I hope you've enjoyed this episode in my 5-part exploration of ethical culture with Vin DiCiani and Eric Feldman from Affiliated Monitors, who is the sponsor of this series. I hope you'll join us again for our next episode. This special 5-part series on ethical culture is a part of the Compliance Podcast Network.